Hollywood has a very short memory. Aside from film studies, few directors, producers, or studio chiefs feel a real connection to silent film, especially film made during the first 2 decades of this 20th century. But consider Selig Studios, which operated out of Edendale, California. In operation for 10 years, Selig Studios developed the concept of documentaries, serials, which is now episodic television, movie stars and the cult of celebrity, and the assembly line factory process of producing more than 2,400 films over 10 years. So let's take a look at William Selig's successes as well as some of his failures. In the early 20th century, no film actor captured the public eye more than Charlie Chaplin, America's Little Tramp. And D.W. Griffith's epic storytelling and the enthralling, swashbuckling Douglas Fairbanks redefined narrative storytelling on the screen. Conventional wisdom has us believe that these cinematic icons were pioneers in the film industry. Certainly, they played a part in expansive narrative storytelling, but the blueprint, the mechanics of filmmaking had already been established by the time they arrived. Their pioneering efforts took what was already established in the art of film to higher levels, thanks largely to William Selig's approach to filmmaking. Hollywood brought cinematic stories to the masses, but to understand the power of film, one must remember how it all began. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Hollywood was the Wild West of filmmaking. Anyone with a little moxie could walk onto a set, take a job as a furniture painter at $5 a day, and climb the ranks to operate a camera, write a story, or direct actors through their paces. Consider that indigenous people and Mexicans could find work daily playing Indians or villains in William S. Hart and Tom Mix horse operas. Or black men and women working in Kathleen Williams' Jungle Adventures. These actors withstood the insults to their dignity to be paid a living wage for a day's work.
Selig was apparently a very friendly man, very eager to please, and had a definite sense of showmanship. Much like his fellow filmmaker George Méliès, he started out as a stage magician. He would bill himself as Selig the Conjurer or Professor Selig, and he would eventually adopt the name Colonel, feeling it would give him a bit of distinction.
William Nicholas Selig was the fifth of 7 children, born in 1864 to Joseph and Antonia Selig, immigrants from Bohemia. The family lived modestly in Thornton, a Polish suburb of Chicago. Lost in the scrum of 4 brothers and 2 sisters, a shy Selig longed to stand out. He rejected his parents' hopes of following his father into the upholstery business to become a magician and a fantasist. But he was a performer without flair, and his shyness was evident on stage. And on occasion, his magic tricks fell flat. A complacent rabbit refusing to be pulled from a hat or a fumble with cards betrayed him. Eager to remain in show business, he gravitated to vaudeville minstrel shows and attached the moniker of Colonel to his name to lend an air of authority and managerial experience. He found success managing Selig and Johnson's colored minstrels beginning in 1890, and later splitting from Johnson to manage Selig's Mastodon minstrels.
Selig and Johnson would hire this tall, shy black performer named Bert Williams. And apparently there was one night when Williams was on stage telling a joke, and he forgot the punchline. And later on, while he was right in the middle of the song, he suddenly remembered it, blurted it out, and audiences thought it was hilarious, assuming it was just part of the act. But later on, Williams was feeling embarrassed by the whole thing, and Selig actually encouraged him and convinced him to keep on performing. And of course, Burt Williams would one day become one of vaudeville's biggest stars and the top black performer overall.
Selig periodically left Chicago for San Francisco, then south to Riverside, and then on to the southwest to Texas before returning to Chicago. In Riverside, Selig met Burt Williams, a black Bahamian immigrant who would go on to have a stellar career in vaudeville and silent films. The entertainment press would have it that Selig discovered Williams, described as some kind of thick country bumpkin on the dusty streets of Riverside. In reality, Williams was a skilled performer who teamed with George Walker in 1893 in San Francisco to become one of the most popular minstrel acts in the country. Within his small circle of performers, Selig had an entertainer with a commanding stage presence. Williams' star to both white and black audience shined brightly. It would make him the first modern black entertainment star, one of the movie industry's first black leading actors, the very first black man to star on Broadway, and who performed for King Edward VII in England. Selig failed to recognize that Williams appealed to white audiences as much as blacks. Selig's relationship with Williams lasted only 3 years before Williams left to tour nationwide. He also understood there was an established black audience eager for black actors to be portrayed on the screen, yet he squandered an opportunity to create a solid foundation for his soon-to-become filmmaking career. If Selig failed to capitalize on Williams' act, he compounded his failure by allowing black performers Gertie Brown and Saint Subtle to slip through his fingers as well.
A lot of Selig's early films were footage of parades, of politicians like William McKinley, travelogues, and so forth. He also made a number of comic films about country rubes and Irish and black Americans, which of course ranged from patronizing satires to the surprisingly charming 1898 film Something Good, which seems to be a satire of the famed May Irwin kiss from 1896. And it starred black performers Saint Subtle and Gertie Brown. You can't help wondering if Selig ever thought of reconnecting with Burt Williams to appear in his films. Seems like a bit of a missed opportunity.
In 1898, Selig produced 2 films featuring Brown and Subtle, Something Good, Negro Kiss, and Cakewalk, at a cost of $550. Something Good was an extraordinary piece of filmmaking for its time. Brown, only 20 years old, and Subtle, 28, possessed obvious on-screen chemistry as they playfully held hands and negotiated passionate kisses. Dressed in everyday clothing, the film portrays a loving couple without any stereotypical onstage acting or exaggerated behavior. Their dignity is intact. Subtle, famed for his cakewalk dance, which was originated by slaves in antebellum South, continued his vaudeville career, mostly in Chicago, until his death in 1932. Something Good appears to be spontaneous and certainly without context. It's likely Brown and Subtle were at Chicago's Selig studio to film Cakewalk when it was decided to film Something Good. Why Selig declined to take this obvious piece of fun and spontaneity to a fuller, more gratifying conclusion, since he was well versed in the expectations of black and white audience, is a mystery. Yet it's clear that he didn't take his black actors seriously. Six years later, in 1904, a year in which 76 black men and women were lynched in the United States, Selig produced the 4-minute film Tracked by Bloodhounds. In the film, a white thief murders a white woman, and the dead woman's husband tracks the man down and exacts revenge by lynching him from a tree. Selig's limited vision of what is a compelling story is evidenced by his inability to see the big picture, a void that would be filled a decade later by more competent filmmakers. The French filmmaker Georges Méliès was hugely influential in Selig's interest in filmmaking. He pioneered special effects and was known primarily for his fantasy films such as A Trip to the Moon and The Impossible Voyage. Like Selig, Méliès was a magician and only 3 years older than Selig.
Silent film was an art unto itself. I don't think that in any way, except by coincidence, it had much to do with theater or even with talking films.
Unlike Mallet, though, Selig did not pursue fantasy stories or use special effects to any significant degree. Rather, he studied the area of editing, dissolves, and moving action as it entered and exited the frame. Since 1896, Selig had operated a film supply business at 43 Peck Court in Chicago. The company began business as the Multiscope and Film Company, later to become W.N. Selig Company, and finally Selig Polyscope Company. In 1907, Selig relocated to 3900 North Claremont, Chicago. The studio's beginnings were modest. Fire scenes, parades, and documentaries were filmed on modest or non-existent budgets and then sold directly to whomever was interested in screening the films. The studio expanded rapidly as a mammoth glass and brick studio was erected, and soon after, developing, printing, wardrobe, and prop departments were established.
There was great excitement and great fervor and great sense of romance, romantic adventure. They didn't know what they were working in. They didn't know what the future would be. They didn't know what they were doing. They knew that every picture broke boundaries. Some one new thing would be done, a new way of handling the camera, a new way of cutting, a new way of lighting, and they'd be so excited by it.
An early contributor to Selig Studios was Bronco Billy Anderson, perhaps the first real cowboy star of silent film and who was shooting westerns in Colorado. Anderson had developed techniques of a long shot, medium shot, and close-up. But his association with Selig was brief because Selig didn't see the advantage, and likely the expense, of shooting western scenery, the long shots and establishing shots, in his releases. The director Francis Boggs brought Selig Studios to Los Angeles in 1909. Boggs had joined Selig in Chicago in 1907, and he was a frequent visitor to Los Angeles over a 2-year period. What impressed Boggs the most about Los Angeles was the fact that it had 300 days of sunshine each year, which was vitally important to filmmaking during this period. He convinced Selig to open a West Coast branch in Southern California. The two men scouted for locations and decided on Edendale, which was about a 20-minute drive from Hollywood.
My mother went to work in a hotel in Los Angeles. She met movie people that were coming out to investigate possibilities of making movies in California. So they asked her where a good place was. She mentioned Edendale right away because we lived there, we liked it, the climate was fine. So sure enough, they came out, looked at the little valley, and it became one of the early motion picture studios.
retail studio on what is now Glendale Boulevard was massive. It was enclosed by a high wall with access through 2 iron gates. The studio's architecture was Mission Revival, and the lot's buildings were topped by red tile roofs. Behind the studio were 60 acres of pristine rolling hills, with the San Gabriel Mountains serving as a backdrop for filming westerns. A short while later, Bison Studios opened. A year later, Pathé Studios joined Selig 1 block away, followed by Pacific Coast and Keystone Studios. The floodgates opened and other filmmakers followed.
The visual storytelling language of cinema, such as it was for the first decade or so of movies, was pretty much proscenium-based. You'd point the camera in the direction of the actors, start cranking, and then the carefully rehearsed actors would enter the shot, play out the scene, conveying absolutely everything and more through gesture. And then when the story point was done, they would exit the shot, and then and only then would you cut.
Selig's earliest star was 9-year-old B.B. Daniels, who would survive working as a child actor to appear in a string of Harold Lloyd comedies.
In 1909, you were just 8 years old, B.B., and the Selig Film Company paid you and Mother $5 a day.
Yes.
By the time she appeared in Selig's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1910, she was already a veteran actor, having started her career at the age of 4.
When most children were 5 years old, of course, they were playing with dolls, but you, B.B., were playing serious roles on the stage.
That's right. And Mother and I had some wonderful times together.
Yes.
Well, there were hard times, too, times when there were no engagements for Mother, and you had to skimp and make tough work of yourself to make both ends meet. And still ever cheerful, ever hopeful, Mother taught you to face each day with a smile. What is it you used to say?
Let's see.
Phyllis?
If you think right, everything will be right.
Right.
She's been a wonderful mother.
It was during one of these lean spells in the theater that Mother decided that you and she should try the flickers, wasn't it, Pete?
Oh, yes.
What was
She said, you know what she said?
What did she say?
Well, when somebody suggested that we go into motion pictures, she said, I've done a lot of things in my life, but I will never stoop that low.
Francis Bogg and Selig began to notice that B.B. Daniels was attracting a following as fan mail began to flood the studio offices. Bronco Billy may have helped bring the Western genre to the screen, but it was Selig who brought fresh Westerns to the movie audiences each week, with Tom Mix leading the way. Tom Mix would set the tone of cinematic Westerns for decades, appearing in Selig films beginning in 1909. Mix's Westerns were rudimentary with a documentary feel, but the public ate it up. He was considered a real cowboy.
I first joined the pictures in 1905. A company came down to my ranch where I was working and got me to ride them. Then they came down the next year and asked me to go to Hollywood, so I went. I bought my first Tony horse in 1909 for 50 shillings. I used Tony for the close-ups, like hard tricks to do and so forth and so on, from tying knots. But I used less valuable horses for the rough work.
Stage actor Hobart Bosworth was an early Selig star. Bosworth was a trained stage actor, beginning his career at the age of 18 in San Francisco. He came down with tuberculosis, which severely affected his voice, but he saw silent film as a means to continue his career. Bosworth helped bring in the dignified British stage actor Herbert Rawlinson, who went on to appear in numerous melodramatic films. He would later become the elder statesman of the film industry until his death in 1953. William Farnham was a veteran stage actor, most notably for performing in the title character in Ben-Hur on Broadway. Brother of film actor Dustin Farnham and director Marshall Farnham, he joined Selig in 1914 with The Spoilers. His one real fight scene with Tom Santaci looked so real and was so raw that both actors were technical advisors for the scene in subsequent two later remakes of the movie. Like Tom Mix, Tom Santaci was a loyal actor to Selig Studios, joining Selig in 1907 in Chicago and moving to Los Angeles in 1908. Santaci remained with Selig Studios until 1917 when he joined Goldwyn Pictures. Handsome with sandy hair and a square jaw, Santaci proved adept at any genre, most notably westerns and jungle adventures featuring Kathleen Williams. Stage actress Iva Shepard, a native of Cincinnati, was a rising star at Selig, often paired with Hobart Bosworth or Tom Santaci. She left Selig in 1913, abruptly retired from films in 1916, and returned to the stage. She had married and divorced actor Lyle Clement, and although she made some television appearances in the 1950s, she never returned to the screen. Director Francis Boggs discovered Betty Hart in 1908 and immediately cast her in his films. She would go on to appear in more than 100 silent movies before retiring in 1916. She was an early female stunt performer, and she wrote her own scenarios for film. Towards the end of 1911, Selig Studios was riding high as the leading company in Edendale. The studio's film output during the first 10 months of the year was more than 150 films, with the actor Herbert Rawlinson starring in about 33 movies alone by the end of the year. Selig's factory-style approach to producing movies paid off, but his director, Francis Boggs, was the heart and soul of the studio, a visionary whom the actor Hobart Bosworth once said would rival D.W. Griffith in epic storytelling. But Boggs was killed in an unprovoked shooting by fired studio gardener Frank Minomatsu in October 1911. Boggs' death would have a profound impact on the studio's future. Although not immediately apparent, Boggs' death marked the beginning of the end. During the first week of October 1911, my great-grandfather, Rob Wagner, had completed his first film. It was called The Artist's Sons. He was the writer, and Francis Boggs was the director. 3 weeks later, Rob Wagner took a trolley down to Selig Studios to discuss a new project with Francis Boggs. But by the time he arrived, Mr. Boggs was dead, and William Selig was seriously wounded in a shooting. Rob Wagner's great-great-grandson, Nicholas Wagner, explains.
Inside this wall were the studio stages, and on the other side of this building were the studio offices. My great-great-grandfather, Rob Wagner, was coming down this street in a trolley, approaching this intersection. And at the gate, he noticed Tom Santaci. As Wagner stepped off the trolley, both men heard gunshots and raced onto the studio lot. Santaci reached the offices first. Wagner saw Francis Boggs dead on the floor with a gunshot wound to the chest and Selig shot in the arm. Wagner saw Santaci struggle with the studio gardener, yanked away his pistol, and subdued him.
William Selig could not or did not want to hire a director that held an artistic vision similar to Boggs. Scenarios became static. Two reelers remained the company's bread-and-butter films to generate revenue, but each film was a variation of the one before. There was no influential company director, like Boggs had been, to tell Selig that feature productions were their future. With Boggs gone, the studio's growth was stunted. A great many of the films in the Selig pipeline at the time of Boggs' death went to in-house director Colin Campbell, a competent journeyman director, but he had little of Boggs' vision or flair for the melodramatic.
Nowadays, we tend to assume that film roles for women in the 1910s must have been more stodgy, more limited in some ways, but that's not exactly the case. It was actually very common for actresses to do action scenes and to do their own stunts, and while they tended to retain a sense of dignity or femininity in these roles, that didn't mean they were averse to jumping from burning sets or running along top of moving trains, something like that. So, in the Adventures of Kathleen, audiences would come in droves each week to watch her riding elephants, facing down lions, things like that, and they loved it.
Kathleen Williams was Selig's biggest draw at the box office with her adventure serial, The Adventures of Kathleen. It led to dozens of copycats from The Perils of Pauline to Flash Gordon and beyond. Williams was a true star. She set fashion trends and inspired a line of clothing. So popular was her adventure serials that she became a trendsetter in women's fashions. A waltz was created for her and a cocktail was named after her. Her forte was working with animals. Her jungle pictures excited movie audiences with her courage to stand toe-to-toe with lions, leopards, and other wild animals. Jungle pictures were an outgrowth of William Selig's love for animals and his insistence in including wild animals in many of his films. His collection of animals far exceeded other studios to the point that he would contract his animals to rival filmmakers. The collection developed into the 35-acre Selig Zoo, established in 1915. In an era that predates the protection of animals and safety measures on the set, it's a wonder that actors and animals were not seriously injured or killed during filming. Williams had a reputation for having a casual attitude toward dealing with big cats, often gazing at the animals with the look of a silent child, unconcerned with the dangers before her. Williams would claim the key to safe interaction with big cats was to show no fear and to keep an eye on them, but leopards were especially aggressive. On one occasion, an actor placed his hands on Williams' shoulders and a leopard sprang for his throat. Williams and crew members managed to distract the animal, and the actor suffered only minor injuries. Williams herself was injured on the set of Lost in the Jungle when Williams missed her cue to hide behind a rock and was attacked by a lion that left a deep gash in her scalp.
Around 1909, 1910, and we don't know how this happened or why, but it happened, and filmmakers at all the different production companies, Biograph, Edison, Vitagraph, Selig, Imp, Universal, and more, started trying things where they would leave things out. Shots that didn't show absolutely everybody in this scene. Cutting before the whole thing was over, maybe cutting to another shot. Cutting back and forth from one location to another, leaving more and more for the audience to fill in. And this continued to develop through the 1910s and then onward and onward through the 1920s, through the end of the silent film era.
Feature-length films were changing the industry very rapidly in the mid-1910s. Directors like Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith recognized that longer pictures meant more room for action, character development, and were much better suited for epic storytelling. So studios like Vitagraph embraced longer pictures early on, as did stars like William S. Hart, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks worked almost exclusively in feature films.
Few performers proved their film bona fides as a serious artist than Douglas Fairbanks with his feature-length adventure films. But even as early two-reelers, like the bizarre, cocaine-fueled, yet highly entertaining The Mystery of the Leaping Fish, were a fresh approach to comedy. D.W. Griffith had been making movies in Southern California since 1910. By 1914, he was shooting feature-length films, giving him the experience to film his controversial 12-reel epic but racist Birth of a Nation, which sparked the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Despite its subject matter, it provided an early example of narrative storytelling.
He had tremendous imagination. In those days, they didn't have what they call a cutback. For instance, showing you downtown in Los Angeles and showing me up here at Pick Fair. They didn't have that switchback, you know? And also, I think the first close-up was made of me in a picture called Friends with Henry Walthall and Lionel Barrymore. And many mechanical things like irising down or irising in, you know, or fade out. All these things came from D.W. Griffith.
Cecil B. DeMille produced and directed The Squaw Man in 1914, considered the first feature-length film and the first to depict an interracial romance. The Squaw Man featured the actress Red Wing from the Winnebago tribe and reportedly the first Native American to act in movies. The Squaw Man, starring Dustin Farnham, was filmed at the Lasky DeMille Barn and at Vine Street and Selma Avenue. The barn was considered the first studio in the community of Hollywood and still stands today as the Hollywood Heritage Museum at 2100 North Highland Avenue. As Selig struggled in 1914 to keep his studio solvent, Charlie Chaplin arrived to single-handedly change the direction of film as an art form. Chaplin slowed down the pace of his slapstick and changed the concept of comedy from having the tramp creating comedic moments to having his character react to life's indignities by remaining dignified yet defiant in the face of abusive authority. He added intelligence and pathos to his films. The Tramp generated empathy along with laughs. It was not long before Chaplin, Keaton, and later Harold Lloyd, whose co-star was the Selig veteran B.B. Daniels, dominated movie screens with ever-expanding and complex visuals. The power that went along with the popularity of Chaplin, Griffith, Fairbanks, as well as Mary Pickford, led the four filmmakers to create United Artists in 1919. It gave performers, not studio chiefs, complete free rein to develop movies.
Behind me is Chaplin Studios, which up until recently was the Jim Henson studio, home of the Muppets. In 1917, when Chaplin decided to build his own studio, other filmmakers were doing the same thing, veering away from Edendale to have more space and the freedom to build more elaborate sets. In 1912, Universal Pictures was founded by Carl Laemmle. He decided to build his studio on 230 acres above the Cahuenga Pass at Hollywood. Paramount was founded when Thomas Ince left Bison Studios in Edendale to found his studio on the Sunset Boulevard on the Pacific Coast Highway. Even though Selig Studios was only 8 years old when Chaplin began his own studio, it was clear that many filmmakers were veering away from Edendale and it would no longer be the home to movie studios.
Nearly 2 decades after Selig allowed black actors Burt Williams, Gertie Brown, and Saint Settle to slip through his fingers, he had a chance to redeem himself to the black community he once ignored with a sprawling film that would be an answer to the racist Birth of a Nation. Black communities were outraged at the portrayal of blacks in Birth of a Nation and waged a campaign to counter what they called the brainwashing of American viewers. Emmett Scott, a close aide to Booker T. Washington, wanted to produce a film that portrayed blacks with dignity and intelligence by offering an overview in epic proportions of the history of the black race from Africa to enslavement to rising to become contributing members to American society. Emmett Scott's film would be The Birth of a Race. The ambitious project had absolutely zero funding, and Scott struggled to find investors. Scott went hat in hand to movie studios, including Vitagraph and Thomas Ince Studios, and independent white investors. He found doing business with the white-dominated movie industry was difficult, if not deceptive. Scott, meanwhile, had turned to Selig Polyscope to make his dream project. In 1916, a year after the release of The Birth of a Nation, Selig agreed to partially fund The Birth of a Race and produce it on the Selig lot. Selig spent $140,000 and filmed half the story when he pulled the plug. Selig studio officials cited the changing character of the film with a large portion of the black story dropped. The film was indeed watered down by dropping the focus on blacks and emphasizing the human race to attract white moviegoers. While this was true, a more likely reason was that Selig Studios was financially ailing and 1 year away from closing its Edendale studio due to serious cash flow problems. Its modest operation could not accommodate the grandeur of the story. The film was to be at least 12 reels, and filming half would allow much of the black story to be told. But the film portion was never produced and was presumably destroyed. For all of his experience during his early years in black vaudeville and his relationships with black performers, Selig could never pull the trigger to deliver entertainment for black audiences. Birth of a Race was another and final lost opportunity. The film ultimately was produced in Tampa, Florida by the theatrical producer Daniel Frohman, with John Noble directing. Scott remained a co-producer.
Eyes of blue, but I never cared for eyes of blue, but he's got eyes of blue, and that's my weakness now.
Selig sporadically worked as an independent producer in the 20s, but by this time the industry was a different world. The Jazz Age had begun, and the public was enamored with flapper types like Colleen Moore or Clara Bow. And Selig's former star actress Kathleen Williams was now more associated with the Gibson Girl era. The S-curve corsets, the hair piled on top of the head. And she ended up doing freelancing, mainly portraying older women.
Perhaps the three actresses who best invoke the Jazz Age are Colleen Moore, the original flapper, Clara Bow, the first It Girl, and Louise Brooks with her dark get-back stare.
Colleen, of course, had a complete change of appearance to any woman that had ever been famous as a beauty. The women that were famous as beauties at that time were buxom, and they had little waists and large bosoms and lots of hair, mostly in curls. And Colleen came along, and she was skinny and flat like a boy, and she began to wear her hair straight. I cut it the first time with a pair of copy shears. Everybody put their hair up in curlers, and we thought it'd be fun if they stopped. So we cut her hair short, and oh yes, the first bangs.
Louise Brooks, as insecure as she was about her own talent and looks, often praised the performances and beauty of other actresses. She was especially fond of Clara Bow, who Brooks considered an outsider among the Hollywood elite, much like herself.
I thought she was the most marvelous star of the 20s because she was the 20s, really. Garbo came from Europe, and Swanson was already very sophisticated, dressy, and Cecil B. DeMille, but Clara was, as she called herself, the real jazz baby.
Brooks was rarely forgiving about what she considered her lack of talent and beauty. The camera thought otherwise.
That's why I was never an actress. I never was in love with myself. I would go to a party and I'd see Dolores Del Rio and Constance Talmadge and Constance Bennett, all these beautiful women, and I'd say, you're the ugliest one here. You're black and furry, you've got freckles, your dress is not as attractive. And in the end, so unless you can't be a great actress, unless you think you're beautiful, and it's of the essence.
By the time Prohibition was in full swing, the concept of beauty in the female form had been completely redefined. Selig had completely lost touch with the new generation of movie audiences. Sets became more elaborate and sophisticated, on-location shooting became more complex and yielded stunning results on film, and glamour was the name of the game on the screen.
Selig was one of the older filmmakers that largely clung to the old two-reel format. His cowboy star Tom Mix, for instance, rivaled William S. Hart for popularity, but he was kept largely in two-reelers while Hart was churning out features. And as it turned out, not changing with the times meant that Selig would start getting left behind.
Selig's competitors were leaps and bounds ahead of the Edendale operation. United Artists, famous players Lasky, Goldwyn Studios, and Paramount were not keeping up with society trends, they were defining those trends. By the time that Prohibition was underway, the Gibson Girl was dead and buried, and the flapper reigned supreme. None of this, however, impressed Selig, who believed that two-reelers were the perfect length to keep the attention of moviegoers. Selig had a rocky relationship with exhibitors who only booked films that they were confident could make a profit. The smaller studios were often poor risks. In addition, exhibitors and Selig often argued who would pay for promotion of films. To give the smaller studios more clout, the Chicago distributor George Klein developed a four-way distribution partnership in 1915 that included Selig, Vitagraph, LKO Company, Essanay, and Lupin. But further attempts to merge distribution with famous players Lasky failed and the partnership was dissolved. This left Selig struggling to find a way to distribute his films. Selig's distribution problems were one of many issues facing the studio. The demise of Selig Studios was a death of 1,000 cuts, mostly self-inflicted. Stubbornly clinging to an outdated formula, Selig refused to look at the world in front of him. His accomplishments were many, though. Child actors were ubiquitous, animal serials were common, with the most popular being Rin Tin Tin. Even animated mice were in high demand from audiences. But set decoration became an art form in and of itself. Staging scenes, choreography, and musicals with the advent of sound breathed fresh air into a new, enhanced medium. Selig Studios was a shell of its former self. Its final week of releases was on January 26, 1918. A year later, Selig Polyscope sold $100,000 worth of bonds to pay its debts on the Chicago and Edendale properties. By the end of 1919, the Selig Board of Directors signed over all licenses and copyrights to Selig, and the company was effectively dissolved.
Pretty much all visual storytelling language that we know for movies was developed during the silent film era. Cuts, dissolves, fades, camera movement, handheld, jump cuts, flash cuts, you name it. It all was created during the silent film era.
Combined, silent film and music were the universal language, and America controlled films of the world.
Modern Hollywood has a lot to thank Selig for in how the movies and TV shows are packaged and presented to the public. Modern audiences consume movies much the same way moviegoers did in 1910. Even in a fractured media environment, the public still enjoys entertainment in a darkened movie theater. And nothing is taken away from films if downloaded and watched on a smaller screen in the living room with the family. Norma Desmond once said, "I am big, it's the pictures that got small." Maybe so, but audiences still watch pictures, no matter the size, and enjoy it as much the same way as they did 100 years ago.